In the annals of human history, there are moments that defy understanding, events that tear a hole in the fabric of perceived reality. The year was 1816. It began as just another year in the wake of great wars, a time for rebuilding. But something was profoundly wrong. The sun, a constant and reliable source of life, grew dim. This was the dawn of a global drama, a climatic anomaly that would be etched into memory with a name as chilling as it was simple: the year without a summer. This was no artistic flourish, no poet's exaggeration, but a stark and brutal fact. The familiar warmth of the season simply abandoned the northern hemisphere. A relentless, unnatural cold descended, an ordeal that would stretch for 3 agonizing years. Imagine the atmosphere of the time. The calendar reads June, then July, the very heart of a season meant for growth and prosperity. Yet outside, a deep winter laid siege to the land. Across much of the European continent, snow blanketed the earth where sunshine should have been. The sky was a permanent shroud of leaden clouds, and the summer months were marked not by warmth, but by unprecedented frosts. In the German states, accompanied by destructive storms, torrential downpours, and hail that battered the landscape, annihilating everything in its path. Rivers, swollen with endless precipitation, burst their banks. The Great Rhine flooded vast territories, washing away entire settlements and severing lines of communication. In Switzerland, a nation accustomed to alpine coolness, the summer of 1816 brought regular, heavy snowfalls that paralyzed life in the mountain valleys. Under such extreme conditions, agriculture was doomed. Crops rotted in the fields or were frozen before they could even sprout. The foundation of society, food security, crumbled almost overnight. By the end of that first year, the price of grain began its inexorable climb. By 1818, it had soared more than 10 times over. For the vast majority of the population, this was a death sentence. A savage, continent-wide famine took hold. Upon the weakened and malnourished, epidemics of typhus and cholera descended, scything through families and villages. Against this backdrop of desperation, public unrest began to boil. It quickly escalated beyond peaceful protests or common riots. The streets of cities were engulfed by violent pogroms, the open looting of food warehouses and shops. The struggle for resources was waged with arson, with murder. In Switzerland, the situation grew so dire that authorities were forced to declare a state of emergency, imposing martial law and a strict curfew to maintain a fragile grip on the chaos. Civilization itself seemed to be collapsing. In nations considered bastions of culture and progress, people were killing one another for a single piece of bread. The statistics of the lost are staggering. In Ireland alone, the famine and disease of those 3 years would claim tens of thousands of lives. It serves as a timeless, harrowing reminder. The systems we build, the order we cherish, and the very lives we lead all rest upon a delicate balance. A balance that can be shattered in a single season, plunging the known world into a darkness from which it may never fully emerge. From starvation and the diseases that followed, nearly 100,000 souls perished. In a desperate flight from the endless unrest, tens of thousands of Europeans abandoned their homes, their land, their entire lives. A mass migration had begun. They fled across an ocean to America, believing a new world promised salvation. They were cruelly mistaken. This icy nightmare was not a local affliction of the old world. The climatic catastrophe had engulfed the planet. Those who crossed the sea, hoping to leave the cold behind, found the same ruthless anomaly waiting for them. The New World met the refugees with a familiar, merciless cold. From the glaciers of Alaska to the tropical isthmus of Panama, the North American continent was in the grip of an unnatural chill. The summer of 1816, in the American state Green, lay shackled by frost. Farmers watched in horror as their hopes for a harvest vanished beneath a blanket of snow and ice. Here, as in Europe, agriculture was paralyzed. The cold made it impossible to grow the Atlantic. Yet the climatic shift brought with it threats that reached far beyond low temperatures and failed crops. In 1816, a ferocious epidemic erupted in Bengal, India, a direct consequence of the atmospheric disturbance. The abrupt change in weather provoked a mutation in the cholera vibrio, transforming the disease into something far more aggressive, far more deadly. Faced with this new biological enemy, local populations and well-equipped colonial troops were rendered utterly helpless. The British Empire, which prided itself on its military might, suffered colossal losses without a single shot being fired. Nearly 1/3 of the British Army personnel stationed in the southern and central states of India did not survive. An invisible enemy, born of a wounded planet, was now mowing down the ranks of an empire with terrifying efficiency. Nor did the catastrophe spare the densely populated empire of China. For the Celestial Kingdom, the year without a summer became a tragedy of unimaginable scale. The anomalous cold almost completely destroyed the rice paddies, the staple crop upon which the lives of millions depended. The loss of the harvest meant not simply economic hardship, but a famine so vast it inevitably gave way to disease and internal conflict. The entire northern hemisphere was plunged into chaos. It was a stark and brutal lesson in global fragility, a reminder that the fate of civilizations can be altered not by the grand designs of men, but by a whisper of dust from a distant eruption, carried on the winds of a world far more connected and far more volatile than anyone had ever imagined. In some corners of the world, people froze. In others, they succumbed to diseases never before seen. Elsewhere, they perished in brutal wars fought over dwindling resources. An apocalyptic tableau was unfolding. For 3 consecutive years, the Northern Hemisphere was held in the grip of an inexplicable cataclysm. A relentless cold paralyzed all attempts to rebuild a normal life. It decimated the food supply, igniting the fuse of mass unrest. The modern mind naturally asks, what force could unleash such a prolonged and global affliction? In textbooks and encyclopedias, a reassuringly clear answer awaits. Experts assure us there is nothing mysterious at play, offering a scientific theory that is, at first glance, seamless. But if one sets aside blind faith in authority and examines the official version with a mind armed by logic and fact, the narrative begins to fray. It unravels, raising far more questions than it answers. So why did the Northern Hemisphere plunge into chaos and despair, failing to see a warm summer for 3 full years? The answer, it seems, was found long ago, recorded in the works of respected researchers. According to established science, the phenomenon is neither mystical nor inexplicable. The culprit assigned to this global catastrophe is nature itself, specifically a geological process on the far side of the planet. The accepted version points to the colossal eruption of Mount Tambora on the Indonesian island of Sumbawa. The scenario proposed by climatologists unfolds as follows. A massive ejection of volcanic ash and gas into the atmosphere. The sheer volume was staggering, an estimated 150 cubic kilometers of rock, pulverized and launched into the heavens. This dense suspension, upon reaching the stratosphere, is said to have created a vast shield, blocking the sun's rays. The result was a so-called volcanic winter, an effect felt by humanity for several years to come. The logic is disarmingly simple, almost seductive in its linearity. If crops are failing and people are freezing in Europe, the blame must lie with an eruption in the southern hemisphere. This version is considered plausible, even widely accepted, despite one deeply curious historical detail. The explanation itself emerged long after the events it purports to describe. The year without a summer began in 1816, yet the cause of this devastation was only identified and articulated more than 100 years later, in the year 1920. It was then that an American climatologist, William Humphreys, first connected the Indonesian volcano to the European freeze. The implication is profound. The contemporaries of the catastrophe, the millions who suffered and died, had no idea what was killing them. Only a century later, through the detached lens of retrospect, did science arrange the pieces, presenting a story that fit. A story that may, or may not, be the whole truth. One could, in principle, accept the temporal gap. In the early 19th century, the science of meteorology was still in its infancy. The scholars of that era, for all their brilliance, possessed no complete understanding of global atmospheric processes, of the vast and intricate circulation of air masses. It is only natural, then, that an explanation for the catastrophe would arrive much later, with the slow accumulation of knowledge and the advance of technology. The problem, however, lies with the explanation itself. The theory, put forth in the 20th century by the American physicist William Humphreys, appears one of the attempts to force an ill-fitting narrative onto the facts of the world. The American researcher asserted that the ash, ejected by the volcano Tambora in Indonesia, that is, in the southern hemisphere, provoked a winter effect exclusively in the northern hemisphere. And it is here, within this seemingly coherent theory, that a fundamental contradiction begins to emerge. We are asked to believe that a colossal cloud of dust behaved not as a passive participant in atmospheric processes, but as a rational entity, possessed of a clear plan of action and sophisticated navigational equipment. The version sounds logical only until the moment we open a global map of the winds and begin to analyze the physics of the process. It is then that the truth reveals itself. The volcanic ash, in defiance of the laws of nature, would have had to complete an impossible journey, ignoring half the globe in order to freeze a series of very specific regions. A careful analysis of Humphreys' theory, proposed in the year 1920, reveals not minor inaccuracies, but a foundational conflict with the physics of the atmosphere. According to the official version, the source of all the misery was Mount Tambora. It is a critical geographic fact. This volcano is located in Indonesia, deep within the southern hemisphere. During its eruption, a gigantic quantity of ash was indeed thrown into the atmosphere. Yet this ash, according to historians and climatologists, caused a volcanic winter exclusively in the northern hemisphere. Here we encounter a logical impasse that troubles anyone even vaguely familiar with the global circulation of air masses. The ash was ejected into the skies of the southern hemisphere, but the consequences struck Europe and North America. Meanwhile, the southern hemisphere itself, the very stage of the cataclysm, suffered no significant climatic changes. The result is a picture that borders on the fantastic. Millions of tons of volcanic dust rose into the air, but instead of dispersing according to the prevailing winds or remaining within their own latitudes, they purposefully surged across the equator. This assertion directly contradicts the global map of winds. Atmospheric currents are not a chaotic dance. They are a complex yet profoundly ordered system. A system that tells a story far different from the one we have been taught to believe. In the aftermath of an Indonesian cataclysm, the ash, by all rights, should have been ensnared by the atmospheric currents of the southern hemisphere. The laws of fluid dynamics would dictate its dispersal there, a vast, lingering shroud. The notion that this dense, heavy particulate could migrate thousands of miles to the north, defying prevailing winds and crossing the thermal equator, is a challenge to fundamental physics. That it would then concentrate, almost exclusively, over the skies of North America and Europe strains credulity. And yet, for more than 100 years, the accepted explanation has rested on this very premise. We are asked to accept the idea of an intelligent ash, a volcanic dust that by some miracle gathered itself into a cohesive mass, breached the planet's atmospheric and a very specific collection of Western nations. Meanwhile, the Southern Hemisphere, which should have been the first and most grievously wounded victim, remained largely untouched. Such a selective act of force an ill-fitting scientific theory onto a stubborn historical fact. It is as if the dust itself possessed a collective mind and a map upon which its targets for a deep freeze were clearly marked. But even if we concede the impossible, that atmospheric currents somehow conspired to carry the entire blanket of ash from the south to the north, a far more glaring strangeness remains. It is an anomaly that has nothing to do with wind direction or particle physics. The ultimate paradox is written on the map of the Northern Hemisphere itself. Within this geography, supposedly suffocating beneath a volcanic pall, there lies one gigantic, inexplicable clear spot. An immense territory, sharing a border with a freezing Europe, that this global disaster, by some miraculous and unspoken grace, simply passed over. This enchanted place was the Russian Empire. The most baffling chapter in this convoluted climate story is that a global catastrophe, said to have covered the entire northern hemisphere, stopped abruptly at the Russian border. While Western Europe and North America descended into an icy gloom, their populations decimated by famine and disease, a profoundly different, almost idyllic scene was unfolding across the vast Russian landscape. The year 1816. For Russia, it was as if the eruption and the subsequent year without a summer had never happened at all. The contrast between a dying Europe and a thriving Russia is so fantastic it borders on the unbelievable. While snow fell in Berlin and Paris during the summer months, and rivers were choked with ice, the Russian climate demonstrated an enviable stability. The summer was warm, sunny, and favorable for agriculture. Peasants calmly worked their fields, which were neither flooded nor frozen, and gathered abundant harvests. Wheat, instead of rotting on the stalk, filled the granaries, and the surplus grain was actively exported. History presents us with two adjacent, yet irreconcilable realities. One, a world of darkness and starvation. The other, a land of sunlight and plenty. They exist side by side, a profound contradiction that challenges the simple narrative of a distant volcano. It suggests that the story of that long, cold year is far from over, and its greatest mystery is not what happened, but where it did not. By the assurances of climatologists and historians, the average annual temperature in the Russian Empire during the infamous year of 1816 was, in fact, higher than the statistical norm. While the world froze, Russia, it seemed, was basking in the sun. The ash lingering in the stratosphere possessed not only navigational capabilities, but a keen political intuition. We must imagine that these microparticles, acting with a kind of collective intelligence, deliberately gathered over Europe and Scandinavia, creating an impenetrable shield against the sun. Yet this same cloud was apparently terrified of crossing the Russian state border. It would seem the volcanic plume respected the sovereignty of the empire, halting precisely where the domains of European monarchs ended. Across an invisible line, a continent of cold, famine, and death. And just beyond it, an empire of warmth, abundance, and prosperity. Of course, if we set aside the ironic theory of sentient ash, we are confronted with a flagrant violation of the laws of physics. With the constant circulation of air masses, it is impossible for the weather in adjacent regions to differ so radically for 3 consecutive years. One cannot imagine a cyclone carrying the Arctic chill hovering over Germany, yet never once touching the European expanse of Russia. Air knows no borders. The atmosphere is one. And yet, the official version of events insists on this very scenario. A selective apocalypse, which spared one single, chosen empire. At first glance, there should be a cause for celebration. A sign that God, or nature, had shielded the nation from catastrophe. But it is here, against this backdrop of external well-being and abundance, that a sinister anomaly begins to emerge. Logically, in a country with a stable climate and bountiful harvests, life should be calm, measured, and peaceful. The actions of the authorities during this supposedly blessed period, however, were utterly at odds with any picture of prosperity. Instead of enjoying the tranquility, a series of internal processes began. Process war against its own people. A brutal occupation of its own territory. If the climate was stable and no enemy stood at the gates, why did the government feel compelled to enact measures of unprecedented cruelty upon its own citizens? To understand the true state of affairs, one must turn away from the meteorological reports and delve into one of the most controversial administrative decisions of the era, the creation of the so-called military settlements. Official history presents this as a simple economic reform, a way to optimize the crushing cost of maintaining the army. But the methods by which this optimization was carried out suggest a purpose far removed from simple accounting. When the story told by the sky does not match the story told on the ground, one must question which reality is the illusion. It was a system that cast a long and troubling shadow over the state's peaceful intentions. Its implementation began around 1810, but it reached its apex, its most widespread application, during the very years the rest of the world was grappling with climatic chaos. On paper, the logic was sound, even rational. Military units would be transitioned to self-sufficiency. Soldiers would be required to combine their martial duties with agriculture, providing for their own sustenance. It seemed the state had discovered an ideal formula, an army that fed itself, saving the treasury the immense cost of provisions, salaries, and the construction of barracks. But the true nature of the plan was hidden in the details of its execution. For the placement of these regiments, the state did not choose the empty, wild lands that required cultivation. It selected the most fertile territories, and, critically, those already densely populated and long settled. The province of Mogilev became the first grim laboratory. The local inhabitants, people who had tilled this soil for centuries, who had built their homes, their mills, and their lives upon it, were never consulted. They were not asked if they would accept military lodgers. They were simply evicted. Peasants were ordered to abandon their ancestral plots and venture into the distant, undeveloped wilderness. In practice, they were stripped of all their property, condemned to a forced resettlement where many would perish from the cold, from starvation, from sheer deprivation. The villages they left behind, with their ready-made homes, their cultivated fields, and their established infrastructure, were promptly occupied by soldiers. This was not the construction of a new society. It was the seizure of an existing one. The state did not have to erect a single new building for its military. They simply took what belonged to others. In those cases where local residents were permitted to stay, they were transformed into a powerless labor force, subjugated to a rigid, unforgiving military code. Life in these settlements was regulated down to the smallest detail, turning daily existence into an endless barracks drill. If one observes this process without bias, setting aside the benign term reform, a stark picture emerges. It is the picture of an occupying army in a conquered land. Armed troops arrive, drive the native population from their homes, confiscate their resources and their land, and impose their own brutal order. This bears less resemblance to an internal reorganization of the armed forces and more to a classic colonization, the subjugation of a conquered people. And all of this occurred, we must remember, during a time when Russia was, according to the official narrative, experiencing prosperity and record harvests. It begs the question, why would a state resort to such extreme, inhumane measures, deliberately provoking the hatred of its own people? The resolve of the authorities is chilling. Even the emperor, Alexander I, whom historians have often called the Blessed, was unyielding in this endeavor. His vision reveals a profound and disturbing truth about the nature of power, that the line between a nation's internal reform and its conquest of its own citizens can be perilously thin, drawn not on a map, but across the lives of the forgotten. The words, when spoken, were blood-chilling. He declared that the military settlements would be established, no matter the cost, even if the price was to pave the road from Petersburg to Chudovo, a distance of hundreds of kilometers, with the bodies of his own people. The Russian Tsar speaks of his native land and his subjects with the cold brutality of a foreign invader, willing to march across the dead to achieve his aim. Such rhetoric, such action, violently contradicts the carefully constructed portrait of a prosperous empire. This profound inconsistency forces a question. Are we dealing with a grandiose falsification of chronology? Did the events of those years unfold in a way our history has failed to record? A careful comparison of events occurring in different parts of the world within the same sliver of time leads to astonishing conclusions. Let us look again at the map of the year 1816. In Western Europe, a climatic collapse has plunged the continent into chaos. Cold, famine, and social disintegration stalk the land as populations begin to die out. Yet at this very moment, across the vast expanse of the Russian Empire, a process is underway that in its scale and organization resembles a major military campaign. Officially, the country is at peace. This is a relentless, harsh military colonization of its own lands. The facts are stark, the chronology of troop movements staggering. In the autumn of 1816, as Europe began to freeze, a battalion of Count Arakcheyev's Grenadier Regiment was transferred to the Vologda province. An entire region was effectively seized from civilian administration and handed over to the military. In April of 1817, the Polotsk Infantry Regiment was deployed to the Mogilev province. In the Sloboda Ukraine province, 3 regiments of an Ulan cavalry division were quartered. The process escalates, a gathering avalanche. By the end of Alexander I's reign, 12 grenadier regiments and 2 artillery brigades were settled in the Novgorod province alone. In the Kherson and Yekaterinoslav provinces, 16 cavalry regiments had established a permanent presence. When we examine the Russian documents of those years, we are confronted with a striking dissonance. Official reports and military dispatches are filled with details of peasant revolts, the illicit sale of wine in the settlements, and corporal punishment for breaches of statute. But in the records for 1816 and 1817, there is not a single word, not one mention of the global cooling that was annihilating the world's harvest. While Europe fought for survival under a blanket of snow, the Russian bureaucracy was consumed only with suppressing internal unrest and establishing new garrisons. How can these two realities be reconciled? On one side, a West dying from the cold. On the other, an empire that, instead of saving its freezing neighbors or defending against a climatic threat, was engaged in an aggressive redistribution of power within its own borders. One world was ending, while another was being forged in iron, seemingly oblivious to the encroaching ice. The established record of the early 19th century is a tapestry of contradictions. To reconcile them, one must entertain a radical, unsettling possibility. What if the timeline itself is a fabrication? A deliberate displacement of events designed to obscure a terrifying truth? Consider an alternate history. One in which the so-called year without a summer and its attendant horrors did not strike in 1816, but significantly earlier. Perhaps around 1805, or even at the twilight of the 18th century. In this timeline, a genuine planetary catastrophe unfolds. Whether the impact of a celestial body or a series of colossal volcanic eruptions, the result was singular. The climate shifts violently across the globe. An unnatural cold descends, triggering widespread famine, pestilence, and a catastrophic reduction of the human population. State institutions falter. Vast territories are left depopulated. Infrastructure crumbles into ruin. It is a period of chaos, followed by a great silence. Then, after years have passed, the climate begins to stabilize. As the planet thaws, a new chapter begins. The redivision of a wounded, empty world. The very military settlements in Russia and the mass migrations to the Americas we see in the records are not events running parallel to a disaster. They are its direct consequences, enacted during a phase of methodical reclamation. Within this framework, the year 1816 is transformed. It is no longer the beginning of a natural disaster, but the beginning of a man-made one, a global campaign of cleansing and appropriation. The great powers, those who had preserved their resources through the chaos, begin to seize defenseless lands. From the frontiers of North America and the plains of Africa to the ancient heartlands of China and the inner provinces of the Russian Caucasus. Armies march not into thriving villages, but onto territories already weakened and hollowed out by the preceding cataclysm. Their purpose to establish a new, unchallengeable order. The official dating of the year without a summer could thus be a masterful deception, a chronological sleight of hand to mask the true cause and staggering scale of the world's reorganization. Once this shift is accepted, the absurdities vanish. The scattered, dissonant pieces of the historical puzzle suddenly lock into place, forming a single, coherent, and terrifying picture. If one abandons blind faith in official dogma, the events of the early 19th century cease to be a series of accidents. They become the chronicle of a global reset. The convenient theory of a volcanic ash cloud that miraculously picks its victims according to political maps simply disintegrates. It gives way to the brutal, yet comprehensible logic of survival and the violent redistribution of power. History, we are told, is written by the victors. But perhaps their greatest victory is not won on the battlefield, but in the archives. The power to rewrite not just the story, but time itself. The great cold receded. As the sun once again warmed the face of the earth, an epoch of thawing began. It was in this precise moment that the surviving centers of power, the monarchies of Europe, the fledgling American government, the Russian autocracy, stirred from their slumber. They did not merely rebuild, they began a sweeping, relentless expansion. An imperative drove them to restore control over vast territories whose resources now lay exposed, undefended. A global redivision of the world was underway. Now, with this alternative map of events unfurled, a choice presents itself. On one side, there is the official version, a story of atmospheric ash that defies the laws of physics, that travels along selective trajectories, an ash that seems to fear the crossing of sovereign borders. On the other, there is a logical, if cynical, history, a chronicle of catastrophe, followed by a ruthless reordering of the world, orchestrated by the powerful. One must ask, which seems more plausible? A magical meteorology that works in perfect service to the historian's narrative? Or the unchanging, immutable nature of humanity, striving for power and control at any and all cost? The answer to that question may not simply offer a different version of the past. It threatens to permanently alter our perception of the history we were taught to accept as truth.